Welcome to From the Mind of Christine McConnell. In today's episode, we are tackling something really fun in a back room of the house that I call the den. It's kind of like a living room where we spend a lot of our time, and for that reason, I want it to look really beautiful. Now, it is the back of the house. In these old Victorian homes, they spent all of the money in the front of the house where people were going to see all of the adornments and sort of special extra details. And back there, there are virtually none. So for that reason, I think I have a great idea on how to elevate the space. And so with that said, let's begin. This room has actually lived quite a few lives. I can only guess at what its original purpose was. It's just off the kitchen, so my best assumption is that it was either a workroom or a relaxing room for servants and housekeepers. And then by the 1960s, it was being used as kind of a winter garage for the house's owner. His name was Thomas Shepard, and he was building all sorts of strange, unusual things in here, including what I believe is a go-kart. In the 1980s, the house was sold to a couple who ran it as a bed and breakfast, and one of the first things they did was remove the walls that connected it to the kitchen, making it sort of one flowing space, and they converted the room into kind of like a bar lounge area. And I'm guessing it was right about that time that this glamorous, exotic pineapple motif was applied as a border around the room. So sadly, this is going to be going away, and we are going to be installing something called a coffered ceiling. The very first thing I need to do is measure out the ceiling and make a grid on it that indicates where these decorative beams are going to run. Okay, so we actually got really lucky, and the room is mostly square, meaning the measurements are pretty even all the way around, which, considering the age of the house, is kind of unlikely. So now we are going to add a layer of beadboard to the ceiling. There is some beadboard going along kind of the wainscoting on the lower end of the walls, and so I want to do this to basically tie into that. We picked up all of the supplies we needed at Lowe's Home Improvement, and just to tell you honestly, I think we spent just under $2,800 on all of these materials, which obviously that's a lot of money, but at the same time, if you were to pay somebody to do this, it would have cost so much more. The beadboard I picked up had two sides you could use. The first was kind of your traditional looking beadboard with sort of a 2-inch gap. And then on the opposite side, it was more like a plain slat. And the wainscoting around the room has something that looks pretty similar to that. So for that reason, I'm going to be using the back side. Coming from the store, these planks were 8 feet across, and I got really lucky with the room being exactly 12 feet across. So all you needed to do was cut these planks in half, and then from there, all I needed to do was create 3 rows of 4-foot sheets, and this way, I didn't waste anything. The beadboard has a tongue and groove system, so every one that you've sort of nailed in, the next one just kind of clicks in right behind it. It locks everything together, and it makes this go so quickly. To be honest, I was kind of dreading getting to the light fixtures and the 3 other things that I'm going to have to cut around on the ceiling, but it actually turned out to be ridiculously easy. All I would do is I would click in my boards, mark what I needed to cut, and then I just used a scroll saw to sort of cut out all of those little pieces. I used a contour gauge to figure out the curve around this chimney pipe, and then from there I just laid it on the boards that I was going to be nailing in, marked everything, and then cut it out with a jigsaw. One of the last pieces was getting cut so thin here at the outer ring portion of this that I needed to put a sacrificial piece of wood directly under it just so that it wouldn't snap. Okay, well that went on really easily, thank gosh. And now we're going to start adding layers of crown molding all the way around the room. Oh, let me pop in here really quick and let you know, doing these 45-degree cuts on the angled crown molding pieces was really tricky. Oftentimes we'd find out you almost have to flip the board upside down and cut it from the opposite side. So it was sort of whatever you thought it was supposed to be, oftentimes it was the opposite. And the reason I'm telling you this at all is because these cuts are very important in order for it to all line up correctly. So definitely take your time and think about it a lot before you make those cuts. A really great design tip I can share right now is when you tackle something like this and you're picking different designs to go next to other ones, it's really great to keep something kind of simple in between things that are very elaborate and detailed. And the reason you want to do that is it actually allows your eye to really appreciate the details as opposed to cramming a bunch of details all right next to each other. So what I've done here is you've got a lot of scalloping up on the very top, some more details, and then just a bit of a plain board, and then a really finely detailed picture rail at the very bottom. And hopefully what this achieves is something that looks really intentional and kind of draws your eye in when you walk into the room. All right, now that that is all up, we can actually start assembling our coffered beams. The way that I'm doing this is I'm going to be stacking 3 boards on top of each other, laying 2 decorative pieces of molding alongside it, and only nailing in that top layer. This way, when I lift it off, I can actually just remove those boards that were underneath, and I've created a little bit of a cavity there that I'll be using later. Once I had done that, I then crab walked back to the beginning, stacked one of those boards directly on top, and I'm now nailing that in. And then what this is going to do is just add a lot of depth. The very last thing I'll add is these 2 strips of really finely detailed thin millwork. And what this is just going to do is kind of make something that's fairly simple, which is just a couple of boards, look so much fancier than what it is. After that first one was completed, then I just needed to make 7 more for a total of 8 beams. Once they were all ready to go, then I cut one side of them at a 45-degree angle, and this is going to be the part that abuts that crown molding that we installed. So figuring out a really great cut for these beams to lock into this angled crown molding was a bit of a challenge because there are so many hills and valleys on the crown molding. But I think I came up with a method that I wouldn't call it terribly easy, but it does kind of simplify the process and gives you pretty uniform results. The very first thing I needed to figure out before trying this technique was to measure the width of the bottom and the top, as well as the height of the 2 sides. Once I had determined that, I just measured that out on thick cardstock paper and cut those pieces out. Then using some scrap wood from the molding project, I just basically assembled a mock version of a profile of that. And then once I had one that was pretty close, then I laid a piece of paper right up next to it and pencil marked that exact design. After I was happy with how that looked, I then cut that out and started to assemble those pieces of paper that I had cut out earlier. Because the bottom is a lot wider than the top of this coffered beam, I'm actually taping my little stencil off to the side a little bit, just because if I sort of plastered it straight down, this wouldn't match up in a correct way to the crown molding. So keeping that distance helps me sort of see exactly where this needs to go. And then I just laid my head on the ground and pencil marked the correct path. I then fully disassembled the thing that I had just taped together, cut that design out, then stacked it on the opposite side, marked everything and cut that out. This way it matches perfectly on both sides. Next, I reassembled everything, and now it's as simple as sliding it onto the beam and marking whatever negative space needs to be cut away. After that was complete, now I just needed to break out my Dremel and start clearing the stuff away. All right, that was easily the hardest part of this entire project, and now all I need to do is map out a path for these beams on the ceiling. Comparatively, this next step is just obscenely simple. All I needed to do was set one of the beams onto this paper, draw the width of it, find the exact center, and then mark that down the length. And then I'm just going to cut out little widgets along the way so I'll be able to see the line when I hold this up to the ceiling. And then it's as simple as me just marking the sides. After I had created all of my lines, the captive helped me one at a time hold up each beam, find its cross point, and from there it was just as simple as making those cuts. Because the length of each of these is bound to be slightly different, I did mark the inside of each cavity with where it was supposed to rest, and then just on the off chance something terrible happens at some point and someone needs to take this down, I included a special little message for whoever stumbles upon that. To secure my beams into the ceiling, the method I came up with was to take a thinner board that would easily fit within the cavity of the beams, and I drilled this into the ceiling, and I did so many drills and made sure each plank hit multiple places on studs, so it was incredibly secure. And then from here, I will be able to drill the beams directly into this wood piece, and because this sub-beam is so locked into all of those studs, I know those decorative beams won't be going anywhere. For the sake of uniformity, on each of these beams, I measured 10 inches inward from both ends, found the center, and then pre-drilled all three. And from here, these are going to be my 3 points that will be screwed into that sub-beam. So now I'm going to create the center pieces of these beams, and the way that I'm doing this is I'm taking the scraps or the extra pieces from those side pieces that went around the room. And what that means is I am going to end up with a seam right in the center of these 4 central beams. This isn't completely ideal, but obviously I don't want to be wasteful, and the wood was really pricey. So for those reasons, that's why I'm going this route. To fuse these two halves together, I'm taking a scrap of some of the board that I used to actually create them, placing it down in here, and then I'm just going to hold this all together very tightly and start nailing it together. Once I knew they were going to be a really great fit, I began pre-drilling and installing the final four. Something that's really great is if there are any slight imperfections or things don't quite line up flawlessly, I am going to be covering these seams with a beautiful little medallion that I found right there in the millwork section of Lowe's. For the screw holes that don't get covered or concealed by some sort of decorative embellishment, I am just taking some stainable wood filler, popping it in a pastry bag, and I'm just going to start piping in everything, smoothing it out, and making sure this whole thing looks terrific. This might sound kind of odd, but I have found that there is such a massive crossover with the skill that is required for decorative cake baking and home improvement. So I think I kind of learned the cake baking thing first and then started tackling these things. And there's just an endless array of skills that you learn in one that are applicable to the other. Okay, any little crack has been filled and now it's time to start staining. This is obviously a very exciting stage because you start to sort of see what it's going to look like. I experimented with a few different colors and ultimately found that the shade mahogany was the best fit. My method for doing this was to apply a really generous coat over small sections at a time, and then once I had it on there, I would lightly rub it down, and then from there, I would actually take a dry paper towel or rag, and I would really buff out the areas that I wanted to highlight, especially this sort of scalloped strip. I did everything I could to get as much of the stain off, and what that ultimately will do is just cause it to stand out and really kind of pop. The flat beadboard area was not too keen to take the color, so the way I worked around this was I would just work in strips of two, so basically like two slats. I would coat them really generously, and then I took a rag that was extremely saturated with the dye, and I would just rub it down back and forth until it looked nice and blended. Oh, one really important thing I should point out is why I'm using a gel stain. I don't think you should do this with anything other than a gel stain, because if you were to use a liquid directly over your head, it would just be splashing everywhere and it would just look like somebody had hooked up a vat of hot chocolate to a sprinkler system and it would just create an ungodly mess. So I would definitely stick to a gel if you can. The very last step for the ceiling project is to do a single coat of a warm satin polyurethane varnish, and this is just going to kind of lock everything in and give it a nice smooth finish. This part's finished and it just looks so pretty, I think. Obviously, we're gonna miss that glamorous pineapple border that was here. Not really. But this just kind of elevates the whole space, and we're not even near done. I'm still going to be hand painting a Victorian pattern around the room, doing new drapes, a ton of furnishings for the room, and this doesn't include the room that's upstairs that we're in the middle of working on as well. So basically, there's a ton of exciting stuff coming. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and until then, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you again very soon.